I remember when I first started becoming more serious about photography, that was back in 1990s. I look at the cameras from different brands and checking which camera should I buy. Pretty much all the best choices were from Japan. Nikon, Canon, Pentax, Minolta, etc. So unless you can afford the super expensive brands like Leica or Hasselblad, Japanese cameras and lenses were considered the best in the market by both professionals and casual users. But it wasn't always like that. Even up to early 1950s, back then Japanese cameras were strongly inspired by the German cameras. The Japanese cameras and lenses were pretty much just the budget option for people who can't afford to spend a lot of money. Only from around mid to late 1950s, with the release of some cameras like the Nikon SP, Nikon F, and some other better quality lenses from many Japanese brands, the public perception starting to change. Japanese cameras and lenses are no longer equivalent to budget choice anymore. So why do I talk about all this? Today, we are looking at this new Viltrox AF 135mm f1.8 lab. It could be the lens that will repeat the history. This could be the lens that will change the public perception of Chinese lenses forever. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Rich Wong here, welcome back to the channel. Before we start, I want to tell you the lens sample that I use in this review was sent to me by Viltrox. They have not paid me any money, but I also do not have to return the lens sample after the review. But if you want to buy this lens after watching this review, I do have an affiliate link in the video description below which will also give you some discount. I just want to make sure everything is clear before we start the review. So let's start this review by looking at the design and operation of this Viltrox 135mm f1.8 lab lens. This is a full frame lens and the sample I have is for the Sony FE, which is what the lens is initially released for. To be honest, I'm not too sure if it will be available for other mounts, but if there is a special mount that you want Viltrox to support, just drop a comment below and let Viltrox know. I'm sure Viltrox will be reading the comments and checking the feedback from you guys as well, so let them know if there is any special lens mount other than Sony that you want for this lens. When I received the sample, I immediately know that this is a big and heavy lens. It's because the box for this Viltrox lens is quite big and is also quite heavy. The Sony 135mm f1.8 GMaster is not a small lens and that lens weighs around 950 grams, which is already quite heavy for a prime lens, but this Viltrox is almost 30% heavier at around 1230 grams. If I put these two 135mm lenses side by side, you can also see similar difference in terms of size. The Viltrox is really a chubby boy. The body of the Viltrox is mostly made of metal. Viltrox said it is aerospace grade aluminum magnesium. The build quality of this lens is definitely excellent. When I hold the lens, it feels very solid, very high quality. There isn't much difference when I compare it with the Sony GMaster. They are both fantastic. Not surprisingly, this Viltrox is a weatherproof lens. There are multiple rubber seals including a red one on the lens mount. Not sure if it's because of the rubber seal. My sample does feel a bit harder to rotate when I try to mount it on my A7CR. The front filter thread is 82mm. The front element has special coating that repel dust and water drops. According to Viltrox, the internal structure of this lens is made of aluminum magnesium. Even the lens hood is very well made. It's not a cheap feeling flimsy plastic hood like a lot of other Chinese lenses. This lens hood feels high quality. It even has a special rubber ring at the front, make it feel nice and also provide a bit of extra protection. The inside of the lens hood is also flocked to minimize lens flare. The only thing I want to see but missing is a button on the lens hood that allows you to completely lock the lens hood. like what the Sony GMaster lens has. There are 2 custom assignable buttons on the lens that you can assign to different features using the Viltrox app, which I will talk about a bit more a little bit later. When you click the button, it gives you very nice tactile feeling. There are 3 switches on the lens. One is the AF/MF switch, one is the focus limiter that you have 3 different options, and one is for you to change the aperture ring from having clicks or not. Yes, there is an aperture ring on the lens, so for photographers, you probably want to enable the clicks. But for videographers, you can disable the clicks to allow smoother aperture adjustments, and also you won't have that clicky noise when you are adjusting the aperture value. The aperture ring is a bit different to the usual aperture ring. It doesn't have a physical hard stop on both ends, so you can keep rotating it forever if you want. There are pros and cons with this design. The good thing is, if you accidentally bump or move the aperture ring when the camera is off, the aperture value won't change, so when you power on the camera again, it remains at exactly the same value as what you had before you power off the camera. And because it doesn't have a hard stop at the end, so this is great for video filming as you can avoid that little bump when you hit the limit. However, what I don't like is when you turn the aperture ring and switching from the minimum aperture f16 to the A setting, which means you now control the aperture value from the camera down. Usually with other lenses that also has an aperture ring, there is a different tactile feeling when you reach the minimum aperture, so you know that you already reached the minimum aperture and you won't just accidentally turn it into A. But with this Viltrox lens, because there isn't that different tactile feeling, there were quite a few times that I accidentally turned the aperture from f16 to A, and suddenly the aperture value jumped from f16 to f1.8, as that was what I previously set on the camera. And the other thing is, when you enable the clicks, it is not 1 click per mark on the aperture scale as I would usually expect. It takes a few clicks to turn each mark. And also the number of clicks seems a bit inconsistent, so I can't just change the aperture value by feeling how many clicks that I have to rotate through. The lens has a color screen on top which displays multiple important information. This is not the first time we see such a screen on Viltrox lens. We saw a similar screen before on the Viltrox 16mm f1.8, which we have also reviewed on this channel. On the display, you can see there is a aperture scale at the bottom of the display, and then the current focus distance is displayed right at the center. If you are shooting in manual focus mode, there would be a focus distance scale at the top of the screen. And they also display some other information like what focus limiter setting you have selected. The display is bright and easy to see no matter you're shooting on a bright sunny day or at night. The animation is also pretty smooth and updates quickly. The thing I like the most about the display is that you can see the current focus distance easily on the screen. I found it very useful when I'm shooting landscape or astrophotography because while the camera and the lens autofocus system works very well, occasionally the camera may focus slightly incorrectly, like when you're shooting landscape that is far away. Instead of focus at infinity, it may actually focus at say around 150 meter distance, which usually I wouldn't notice, but that means the photo would not be as sharp as possible. But now with the display, I would easily notice that if it happens, and I can correct the mistake immediately. Now, one thing I don't like about the display is the aperture scale. Just like the Viltrox 16mm lens, the little triangle which indicates the currently selected aperture is not always right at the center of the display like what I would expect. Instead, the triangle would be at the right side when we are shooting at the maximum aperture. Then it will slowly move towards the left side when you stop down the lens. I've shot with the Viltrox 16mm lens a bit, and now another month with this 135mm lens, and I'm still not really used to it. I would definitely prefer if the triangle indicator just stay at the center. I'm not too sure if it's just me that have a bit of issue with this display, or do you agree with me? Drop a comment below and let me know if you agree with me or not. Since the screen does have its own backlight, so that's why you can see the screen no matter it's during the day or night time. If you are shooting at night, sometimes you may find the screen a little bit too bright or distracting, or even would interfere your shooting. Luckily, you can use the Viltrox smartphone app to adjust how long you want the screen to stay on, or you can even completely turn it off. Okay, now let's talk about the Viltrox smartphone app a bit more, because this is also one very important part of this lens. So the smartphone app is available for both iOS and Android, and you can use it to customize your Viltrox 135mm lens, and presumably more Viltrox lenses will be supported by this app in the future. So what can you do with this app? Once you start up the app and connected your lens to the app, you can check if there is any new firmware available and update the firmware if there's one available. You can personalize the boot animation, which is the image that you see on screen when you start the camera. You can either load a photo from your phone or using text. You can also set how long you want to display the animation. Actually, the word animation I don't feel is quite right, because it's just a static image or text, so it's actually more an image rather than animation. But anyway, it may sound like a gimmick, but I myself do like it. And when I see some of the city images that I create for this lens, and when I power on the camera and see the image, it will give me a little smile on my face. There is the lens screensaver duration setting, which means how long you want the screen to stay on once you finish adjust your setting. You can choose never, which means the screen is always on, or you can choose a value between 1 to 60 seconds. Or if you want to switch off the screen completely, you can just set it to close. You can assign each of the two custom buttons separately using the app. It doesn't look like there is a large amount of features that you can assign to the button, but these are the settings on top of the existing custom settings that you can do on your camera. You just need to choose the mapping setting for that if you want to adjust the setting from the camera instead. So it's actually pretty good because there are some additional settings which is on top of the settings that is available from your camera. You can also find all the other information about your lens, such as the firmware version or the serial number of your lens. So overall, the smartphone app is very responsive and it connects to your lens very quickly and easily. The only thing that is a bit annoying is that every time when the camera went to sleep, the lens would disconnect. So when I power on the camera, I have to reconnect the lens to the app again. So if I'm just mucking around with some of the settings, quite often the camera will went to sleep and then I have to reconnect the lens. But other than that, it's a very nice app and it's also very easy to use. So this lens uses Viltrox's latest Hyper VCM autofocus motor. This is a patent autofocus motor from Viltrox that is designed to drive heavier lenses group to allow faster autofocus speed and better precision. According to Viltrox, it allows the lens to switch from the closest to furthest focus distance within 100 milliseconds. Well, at least this is what Viltrox said. And from my real-world experience, I'm very impressed by how fast the autofocus speed is. I did some side-by-side comparison with the Sony GMaster, and the result suggests the autofocus speed of the Viltrox is virtually the same as the Sony. Actually, there were a few times that I was switching between the Viltrox and the Sony lens, and I feel the Viltrox lens autofocus is a bit snappier than the Sony. And despite the lens has some big heavy element, autofocus is also very quiet. When shooting indoor, I can only hear the autofocus noise when I place my ear right next to the lens, and when I'm shooting just normally, I can't hear any autofocus noise at all. Subject detection works fine as expected. Video autofocus also works very well. When I did some testing using my A7CR and shooting at f1.8, the lens can detect and track my movement smoothly and also very quickly. However, I did notice sometimes the focus wouldn't snap back to the background immediately when the subject leaves the frame. But other than that, it works pretty much exactly just like the Sony GMaster. When the camera is not powered on, or if you haven't connected the lens to the camera, if you shake the camera or the lens, you may hear and feel a bit of vibration from the lens. It's a bit like some of the lenses that has optical image stabilizer. It will also give you a bit of vibration noise if you shake the lens, but with this lens, that feeling is a bit stronger. According to Viltrox, this is normal, and this is just how their new VCM autofocus motor behave. And once you power on the camera, then it shouldn't happen. So if you bought this lens and notice similar things when the camera is off, this is completely normal. Okay, now let's have a look at the image sharpness, and let's start with the center sharpness. We'll do some comparison with the Sony GMaster 145 f1.8 as well. At f1.8, the maximum aperture, Viltrox center sharpness is already excellent. Even though I'm testing with a 61 megapixel camera and zooming at 200% zoom, and also my subject is more than 1.5 kilometers away, we still got really good sharpness. The sharpness is pretty much the same as the Sony GMaster. Both lenses are already really sharp at f1.8. Stopping down the lens to f2.8 would only marginally improve the contrast, but otherwise, sharpness, amount of details is pretty much the same because it was already excellent at f1.8. And everything remains pretty much the same until f8. After that, diffraction will start to soften the image. Now, if we look at the corner, at f1.8, Viltrox corner is decent. I can see a lot of fine details. It's definitely better than my expectation. If we compare it with the Sony, I would say the Viltrox is slightly better, but the difference is very minor. Stopping down the lens would improve the corner sharpness slightly. Viltrox reaches its maximum corner sharpness at f5.6. But to be honest, even at f1.8, the corner sharpness is already pretty good, and I think most people would be happy about it. Okay, now let's talk about the close-up performance. The minimum focus distance of the Viltrox is 0.72 meter, and that gives us the maximum magnification of 0.25 times, which is really not bad at all. The image is also pretty sharp even when shooting at f1.8 at the minimum focus distance. The Sony GMaster lens has very similar minimum focus distance and maximum magnification ratio, slightly better than the Viltrox, but the difference is just marginal. With such good maximum magnification, you can even do close-up shot of part of the face when you are taking portrait photos. Here are two photos, one shot with the Viltrox and one shot with the Sony. Can you guess which lens were used to shot each of these photos? Well, the number one was shot with the Sony and the number two was shot with the Viltrox. They were shot pretty much from the same place, but as I was handhelding the camera, so there were a bit of difference in terms of composition. But if you look at these photos, especially look at the background, there really isn't too big difference between the two photos. The dissolved background melted smoothly in both photos, looks very pleasant. The bokeh balls are nice without nervous highlight. Both photos have a small amount of cat's eye effect, but it's not too crazy. I do notice the Viltrox seems to render the photo slightly warmer and has a little bit more contrast. If we now look at another set of comparison photos, we can see the bokeh is also very similar between these two lenses. The Sony seems to have a little bit more cat's eye bokeh than the Viltrox, but otherwise bokeh is nice in both photos. When you stop down the lens a bit, the outline of the bokeh balls from the Sony is a bit more rounded than the Viltrox, which would turn a little bit into polygon shape at around f4. Now let's have a look at these two photos shot here in my studio with identical camera settings and controlled studio lighting. Both photos were shot at f1.8. First thing, the field of view is almost exactly the same. The colors are a bit different. The Viltrox is slightly warmer than the Sony, as we have already seen in one of the previous comparison photo. It's not a big difference. When I try to do some custom white balance, the difference is about 150K. One more thing I noticed is that the exposure is a bit different, even though the lighting and camera exposure are identical. Again, not a huge difference, but the photo shot with the Viltrox is about 0.1 EV brighter. Let's look at vignetting now. With the shading compensation set to auto, the Viltrox has very minimal amount of vignetting at wide open. Once I stop down to f2.8, then vignetting pretty much completely gone. The Sony GMaster is slightly better with the same aperture setting, but the difference is very small. However, when I stop down the lens further, there is a bit of negative vignetting with the Viltrox. The corners are slightly brighter than the center of the lens, and that is most likely caused by the lens profile correction that is not optimized for smaller aperture. This negative vignetting effect doesn't happen with the Sony GMaster lens. If I disable shading compensation, we see a lot more vignetting from both lenses. At f1.8, the Viltrox has a bit more vignetting than the Sony, but I think the amount is still very acceptable considering it is at f1.8. Once we stop down to f4, then vignetting is virtually not noticeable. The Viltrox has very good chromatic aberration control. Looking at my photos, even the one with very high contrast, I see virtually no color fringing at all. Here is a side-by-side comparison with the Sony. There really isn't much difference between these two lenses. They are both very good. When I did my local test, I see a little bit of color fringing from both lenses, but Viltrox has slightly more noticeable color fringing than the Sony. A short telephoto lens like a 135mm lens usually doesn't have too much distortion. So not surprisingly, I found very minimal distortion from both the Viltrox and the Sony. If you look at these two test photos, there is pretty much no noticeable distortion. Next, let's talk about lens flare. Viltrox lens flare performance is pretty decent. I don't really have any serious lens flare issue no matter I'm shooting at daytime or nighttime with a strong light source in front of the camera. When I did my side-by-side test, Sony seems to have a little bit less lens flare. However, the Sony also has a little bit more ghosting, so overall it's hard to say which one performs better in terms of lens flare. And now we have a look at the Sunstars. With the Viltrox lens, you will have to stop down the lens quite a bit to around f11, then you can start to see a bit of Sunstars. But you really need to stop down to pretty much the minimum aperture f16 to get some reasonably sharp Sunstars. Sony is a little bit better in this area. What I mean is, you still have to stop down the lens to around f11 to get Sunstars, but at f16, the tails of the Sunstars are more even. You don't have the issues that some of the tails of the Sunstars are longer and some are shorter. Sony can also stop down a bit more to f22 to give you sharper Sunstars, while the Viltrox can only stop down to f16. Being such a fast telephoto lens, it could be a good choice for astrophotography if the Coma performance is good. So I shot some astro test photos and let's have a look at the results. This photo was shot at f1.8. If we zoom into the corner, the Coma performance is really good. I don't see much butterfly-shaped Coma flare. You could just shoot your astro photo at the maximum aperture if you want. When it comes to focus briefing, I see some noticeable focus briefing with the Viltrox lens when I did my 1 meter to 20 meter focus briefing test. But there is also similar amount of focus briefing with the Sony lens. I think the performance is quite similar with both lenses in this area. I remember when we went to visit Viltrox headquarters in China last year, Viltrox gave us a tour around their headquarters offices and we met with the Viltrox team and they show us a lot of their upcoming products, and also they told me about the new Lab series lenses. Later on, I published the interview video that I did when I was there, and it was the first time the world heard about the Viltrox Lab series. During my interview, Viltrox told us that their Lab series lenses will be even better than their Pro series lenses, which we all thought is already very good lenses. That was August 2023, and now is November 2024, and the first lens from the Lab series is finally released. So does it meet the expectation? Well, you have just saw all my test results, the comparison with the Sony 135mm f1.8 GMaster, and you saw how close the performance of these two lenses are. I won't say the Viltrox is the better lens than the Sony because I don't think it is. There are a few things the Sony still has better performance, but it's really just slightly better. Now, it's always very hard to quantify how good a lens is, but I feel overall the Viltrox is like around 90% as good as the Sony if we consider everything from the build quality to image quality to features. And there are a few areas the Viltrox is actually slightly better than the Sony. I feel the biggest downside of the Viltrox would be the size and weight of the lens. The Sony is already not a small lens, but the Viltrox is like one size bigger than the Sony. One of the evening, I went out for a 2-hour photo walk with the Viltrox and the Sony a7CR, and my hand and fingers were pretty sore after that photo walk. But then we have to consider the price of this lens. It is only $899 US, while the Sony is around $2,100. Which means the Viltrox is less than half the price of the Sony, more like only 40% of the price, and it delivers pretty much the same performance. Because of that, I think a lot of us can forgive or forget about the extra size and weight. Remember I said at the beginning that Japanese cameras and lenses used to be viewed as budget products for people who can't or don't want to spend too much money? But now, Japanese cameras and lenses are the best in the world. This Viltrox 135 f1.8 lab lens can probably do what companies like Nikon and Canon did back in late 1950s. This is the start of a new era. Chinese lenses can be just as good as the best lenses from Japan and other countries, and this is just the very beginning of this new era. I'm definitely looking forward to the next Viltrox Lab series lens.